In the Pharaoh's last chamber lies a secret meant to sleep forever. Welcome to Echo Slumber. I am your host. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's begin. Beneath the golden sands of Egypt, where the desert breathes secrets into the night, there lies a chamber untouched by time. It is said that within its shadowed heart, the last pharaoh whispered his final wish. Not to the priests, not to the gods, but to the walls themselves. The winds have carried the tale for centuries, its truth wrapped in dust and rumour, waiting for the patient hand to draw it back into the light. Tonight, we walk softly through the corridors of legend and stone, past the echoes of chisels and the scent of ancient incense, to discover what was hidden where no intruder dared to tread. This is not just the story of a tomb, it is the story of a mind that sought to outwit eternity. And as we drift together into this mystery, know that you are part of it, because we truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, babe, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The night in the desert is not silent. It hums faintly with the life that hides from the day. Somewhere in that liminal hour before the horizon begins to glow, the wind moves across the dunes as though it is looking for something. The grains of sand, countless, ageless, shift with each sigh, and you could almost believe they are whispering to one another, passing on an old secret in a language no one living can truly hear. It is here, in this low chorus of wind and grit, that the story of the Pharaoh's last chamber begins. Not with the laying of stone or the ink of a scribe, but with the decision to hide something so carefully, so cleverly, that the earth itself would have to help keep it. The desert had been the Pharaoh's constant companion, a place he both feared and respected. It swallowed armies, erased roads, and reshaped itself overnight without warning. Yet he knew its other gift, that it could preserve. Beneath its surface the air stilled, the heat withdrew, and time slowed to something almost sacred. His final wish was not for a monument that could be seen from far away, but for a resting place wrapped in the desert's protective embrace, away from the grasp of thieves and the vanity of kings. The builders chosen for this work were summoned not in broad daylight, but in the deep hours before dawn. They gathered by torchlight in the courtyard of the palace, their shadows long and wavering on the sandstone walls. Most were already bound to the pharaoh by years of service, but this was different. On that morning, each man, and a few women whose skill in measurement and design was unmatched, pressed their hands to a smooth stone tablet, swearing not just their silence, but their very lives to the task. What was to be built would outlast them, their children, and perhaps Egypt itself. They worked by signals and murmurs, the way the desert fox moves so as not to disturb the sand. Plans were drawn in ochre pigment on goat hide, then erased before the sun touched them. Surveying rods were placed and removed within the same hour, leaving no trace for an outsider to follow. Even the path to the site was disguised, a winding route through ravines and dry riverbeds, so that no one could retrace it without a guide. The first signs of the chamber-to-be were not walls or doors, but patterns in the shifting dunes. The builders learned to read the sand the way sailors read the stars. A dip here meant a hollow beneath. A subtle ridge, no higher than the knee, marked the line where bedrock waited for their chisels. When the wind blew in the right direction, they could see the faintest ripple, as though the land itself was acknowledging their presence, warning them not to move too quickly. There were rituals before each day's work. A line of water was poured into the sand, vanishing in seconds, to honour the desert for what it was about to surrender. Offerings of bread and dates were left in the open, so that whatever unseen guardians might walk the dunes could take their share. No hammer was lifted until the soft chant of the overseer, low, steady half prayer and half command, filled the air. In this way, the site was awakened each morning, not as a place of labour, but as a place of promise. And yet there was something unspoken between them all. The Pharaoh's last command was not only to conceal what he valued, but to shape the very land so that even when memory failed, the desert would not. The builders were not simply making a tomb, they were altering the skin of Egypt herself, coaxing her to hide what they left behind. That knowledge gave weight to every step, every swing of a tool. As the first weeks passed, the dunes shifted and reformed around their growing work, erasing footprints by night and smoothing the ground until it looked as though no one had ever been there. From the ridge above, you could gaze down and see only the undisturbed face of the desert, endless, golden, and innocent. But to the builders, every grain was part of a hidden language, and each morning the wind spoke to them, reminding them that the secret was still safe. The Pharaoh's whisper was not a sound but a presence, carried in the minds of those who served him here. It was in the careful placement of a stone, the deliberate concealment of an entrance. The way they kept their eyes averted from certain places, as though not looking could help keep them invisible. And if you stood there now, centuries later, in that same cool hush before dawn, you might still feel it, a breath against your ear, the desert leaning closer, ready to tell you something it has guarded for 1,000 years, but only if you promise to keep it. Before the first block was quarried, before the first line was drawn in ochre, the dream of the hidden chamber had already taken root in the Pharaoh's mind. It was not born in a moment of peace, but in the long shadow of unease. His reign had begun with the weight of ceremony and the blessings of priests. Yet from the very first year, the air around him felt crowded, not only with the courtiers who bowed low at his approach, but with whispers that did not fade when he left the room. The Nile had been generous in those years, the harvest strong, and the temples flush with offerings. But prosperity did not bring harmony. Ambitious generals, hungry for more than their military titles, had begun to test the boundaries of loyalty. Nobles from the Delta, with their trade connections to foreign ports, grew rich enough to speak in tones just shy of insolence. Even the priesthood, whose role was to guide and bless, seemed increasingly aware of their influence over the people. It was in this climate, one of veiled threats and hidden rivalries, that the Pharaoh began to think differently about his own end. Tradition dictated that a king's tomb be both a monument and a declaration, a great beacon rising from the desert, proclaiming his power for centuries to come. But that visibility was precisely what he feared. He knew the fates of those who had ruled before him, resting places plundered, sacred items scattered to foreign markets, even the bodies themselves defiled in political revenge. No, he decided, his afterlife would not be a stage for the ambitions of the living. It began perhaps as a private defiance. In the quiet of his private chambers, he studied maps not of his kingdom cities, but of its uninhabited edges. He spoke with trusted astronomers about the stars, not for navigation, but for alignment, how to hide a thing so perfectly that only the heavens themselves might reveal its position. The more he considered it, the more it became not just a precaution, but a kind of art, the crafting of a tomb so thoroughly concealed that even the desert would forget it was there. Some believe it was a dream, a vision sent by a god, Haun, that fixed the idea in his mind. In this dream, he walked alone across an endless plain of sand. The horizon swayed and shimmered in the heat, and then suddenly he was standing before a doorway carved into the desert floor. It opened at his touch, revealing a chamber lit not by torches, but by a light that seemed to breathe from the walls themselves. There was no gold, no jewels, only objects whose meanings were known to him alone. And in the farthest corner, an empty chair awaited him. When he woke, his hands were trembling, and he knew the image would never leave him. From that day forward, secrecy became his most sacred tool. He did not speak of the plan to his architects all at once, but in fragments, testing their trust. To one, he described a corridor that led nowhere, its purpose known only to him. To another, he spoke of false chambers, placed like decoys. Even the most loyal among them did not hold the whole design in their minds. In this way, he made himself the sole keeper of the true vision. The desert, in his mind, was not simply a place of burial. It was a lock without a key, a vast shifting vault whose very nature resisted intrusion. Winds would cover his tracks, time would blur the memory of his resting place, and if fortune favoured him, his name might even fade from certain records, so that only the gods and the stars remembered where he lay. It was a plan not for glory, but for permanence. In council, when the topic of his tomb arose, he would nod gravely, speaking of the traditional ways and the noble forms as if nothing were amiss. The courtiers left those meetings imagining a great pyramid or temple. Only he knew that his true legacy would be invisible, a chamber in which the silence itself would serve as his monument. As months passed, the dream hardened into resolve. Messengers were sent quietly to distant quarries. Artisans were summoned under other pretenses, and the Pharaoh, who was known for his elaborate public ceremonies, began to vanish from sight for stretches of time, travelling under the pretense of inspecting border fortresses or agricultural works. The truth was far stranger. He was already walking the land that would one day conceal him, listening to the language of its stones and sand. And somewhere in that vast emptiness, he found it, the place where his dream would take form. They did not come to the palace gates in daylight, nor by the wide avenues lined with sphinxes. The men and women who would shape the Pharaoh's hidden resting place arrived in silence, moving through narrow side streets and forgotten doorways, guided by messengers whose faces were never revealed in full. Each one had been chosen with care, not simply for skill but for the depth of their loyalty, the stillness of their tongues, and the capacity to carry a burden that would never be spoken aloud. The first were master masons, men whose hands could read the grain of limestone as easily as others read papyrus. They knew the sound a chisel made when it met flawed stone, could sense a hidden crack before it betrayed itself. Beside them came the architects, eyes trained on the invisible, angles that existed only in thought, alignments measured not by the sun overhead, but by the position of distant stars. And then there were the carvers, their fingers stained with pigment and dust, whose task would not be to adorn the chamber, but to disguise it, erasing all signs that it had ever been touched by human hands. A scribe, old enough to have seen 2 pharaohs pass into the afterlife, was summoned not for his writing, but for his memory. He was to record nothing. His role was to hold the measurements, the angles, and the sequence of the work entirely in his mind, so that no papyrus could be stolen or burned. Even the overseer of labourers, a man known for his stern fairness, was selected because he could be trusted to enforce silence without cruelty, binding loyalty not through fear, but through the weight of shared purpose. They were brought together in a windowless chamber within the palace, lit only by oil lamps that gave the air a wavering gold. In the centre lay a flat slab of basalt, polished until it reflected the flicker of the flames. One by one, they stepped forward, placing a hand on the cool stone as the high priest recited the oath. The words were both promise and warning, to complete the work in secrecy, to protect the resting place of the Pharaoh for all eternity, and to accept that once the final stone was set, their paths would never again cross in the open world. Some believed this meant death awaited them when the task was done. Others suspected they would simply be sent far apart, never allowed to speak of the chamber again. But none refused. They knew that in serving this vision, they would be joining a lineage of builders whose works were not meant for mortal eyes, whose creations existed only in the realm of gods and kings. Their first journey to the chosen site was under a moonless sky. They moved in a staggered procession, avoiding the main roads, stopping only when the stars told the astronomers they were near. The desert at night is not empty. It breathes with the quiet rustle of unseen life, the shifting of sand under unseen paws. Yet to the builders, it felt as though the land itself was waiting for them, listening. By dawn, they stood upon a flat stretch of desert, indistinguishable from the miles around it. Only the pharaoh and his astronomers could point to the exact spot where the first stone would be laid beneath the surface. They began by mapping the invisible, stretching chords, measuring angles, marking points in ways that would vanish with a single gust of wind. Their tools were simple, but their precision was absolute. Plumb lines weighted with copper, straight edges smoothed with care, and water-filled troughs to gauge the level of the ground. The design they followed was unlike any tomb before it. Instead of rising above the sand, it would sink into it, concealed by false passages and dead ends. The main chamber was to be sealed from within, with no outer entrance in the final stage. Geometry was not only a matter of balance and beauty here, it was a weapon. Angles were chosen to mislead, corridors aligned to confuse even those who found them. Ventilation shafts were disguised as cracks, and blocks were cut to fit so perfectly that they became indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. Yet for all their skill, the builders worked with the knowledge that their hands were shaping something they would never return to see. The final design would not be admired by generations, nor visited by pilgrims. It would be swallowed whole by the desert, its existence known only to those who had sworn the oath. This gave a strange reverence to their labour. Each chisel mark, each smoothing of stone, felt like a prayer, not to be witnessed, but to endure. Days passed into weeks, and weeks into months. The desert tested them with heat that made the air shimmer, and nights so cold their breath curled into the darkness. They adapted without complaint, their focus narrowed to the work before them. When one builder faltered, another silently took his place. The overseer's voice was rarely raised, yet no one disobeyed. The weight of the task bound them more tightly than any command could. Sometimes, in the stillest hours before dawn, they would pause to watch the stars. The astronomers would point to certain constellations, explaining how the chamber's angles would mirror them, so that when the pharaoh's soul rose to join the gods, he would step onto a path written in the sky. Even those who had no interest in the afterlife found themselves moved by the thought. As the foundation of the hidden chamber took shape, the air seemed to change. The desert wind no longer felt indifferent. It carried with it a low, constant hum, as though the land itself recognized what was being built. The workers spoke less and less, communicating through gestures and glances. The oath they had sworn had become not just a promise, but a part of them. And deep in their hearts, they knew, once the last block was set and the final grain of sand swept over the entrance, they would leave this place forever, carrying the secret like a shadow that would follow them to their own graves. In the vast archives of the palace, where rows of papyrus scrolls lay stacked like the ribs of some ancient beast, there were no scrolls that told the whole story. Not one. This was by design. The pharaoh's most trusted scribes, those whose reed pens had recorded victories and harvest tallies alike, understood that the most dangerous truths were those written plainly. And so, the work of concealing the hidden chamber began not with stone or sand, but with ink, and with the careful absence of it. These scribes lived in the quiet shadow of the palace walls, their lives measured in lines of text and the slow, deliberate grind of black pigment against stone. They were masters of their craft, not only in recording what was spoken, but in deciding what must be left unsaid. To them, a gap in a record could be as intentional as a proclamation. In the pharaoh's final years, such gaps began to multiply. Orders concerning the chamber were never written in full. Instead, they were broken into fragments, each fragment disguised as a mundane instruction, an adjustment to the tax on a quarry, a shipment of tools listed as repairs to a temple, a labour assignment worded as river embankment work. To an untrained eye, it was the bureaucratic noise of a kingdom. To the few who understood, these lines were threads in a single hidden tapestry. On temple walls, the pharaoh's deeds were painted with reverence, but here too, a subtle hand worked to obscure. In one mural, a depiction of the pharaoh overseeing the building of a monument was altered so that the monument was left incomplete, its shape deliberately vague. In another, the lines of hieroglyphs curled away from a key symbol, as though the stonecutter's chisel had hesitated and moved on. To the common worshipper, these omissions were invisible. To those who knew, they were markers of a secret passage in the story. Some of the scribes developed a language within a language, metki, the art of shadow writing. A certain choice of word, when placed beside another far down the same column, could form a hidden message if read diagonally. A small tilt in the angle of a bird glyph might signal that the line above it was to be ignored. These were not errors, they were safeguards, a code only those sworn to the pharaoh's purpose could read. Yet the most telling pieces of the puzzle were not the codes, but the silences. The pharaoh's final decade was rich with building projects, yet certain years left almost no records at all. Festivals were mentioned without their locations. Supplies were tallied without destinations. Entire seasons passed in the archives with nothing more than a sentence or two. The Nile was kind. The harvest was sufficient. And behind those simple lines was the unspoken truth. The pharaoh had been elsewhere, walking the desert, laying the groundwork for his hidden afterlife. In some cases, the absence was literal. Papyrus scrolls were burned after reading, leaving only the faintest outline of ash on the reed mat. Temple scribes were instructed to chip away certain glyphs from stone walls. Not whole stories, just enough to break the thread of meaning. Visitors to those temples centuries later would find faint scars in the stone, like the healed wound of a long-forgotten injury. One scribe, whose loyalty was so complete that his name has been lost to time, left behind a strange fragment, a single sheet of papyrus filled with what appeared to be meaningless repetitions of the same three glyphs: a sun, a seated man, and a vulture. To the unknowing, it was a practice page for a novice, but when read with the shadow writing method, it revealed a single phrase: "The chamber will breathe when the stars are right." That scribe vanished from all records thereafter, perhaps retiring to the countryside, perhaps becoming one of the builders, perhaps simply gone. Even the pharaoh's personal cartouches in certain inscriptions were subtly altered. One variation, found carved into a hidden lintel, replaced the usual symbol of eternal life with a more obscure one, the knot of Isis, a symbol often used in protective charms. It was a private reminder to the gods themselves. This tomb was not for the eyes of mortals. And so, the true history of the last chamber survived in the margins, in broken phrases, in erased walls, in the space where a sentence might have been. What the scribes understood, perhaps better than the architects or masons, was that memory could be built as surely as stone. And just as stone could be buried, so too could memory be hidden, not destroyed but folded into the silence, where only the careful and the faithful would know to look. Far from the palace and the quiet chambers of scribes, the story of the pharaoh's last chamber began again, this time in the roar of chisels striking raw earth. The quarries lay in the pale heat of the eastern desert, where limestone glared white beneath the sun, and granite rose from the ground like the bones of the earth itself. Here the work was not one of words or ink, but of muscle, breath, and the steady rhythm of stone meeting tool. The labourers who came to these quarries did not know the full truth of what they were shaping. Most believed their blocks were bound for a new temple or the outer walls of a fortress. Yet the overseers, those sworn to the oath, selected each block not only for its quality, but for the role it would play in a design far from their imagination. Limestone for the inner chambers, chosen for its softness, under a chisel, and its ability to hold fine detail. Granite for the seals and doorways, chosen for its strength and refusal to break. Every type of stone spoke a different word in the hidden language of the pharaoh's plan. The process of extraction was a ritual in itself. At dawn, before the first strike, the workers gathered in a circle. A small libation of water was poured onto the rock, an offering to the earth for what it was about to surrender. Then the overseer would touch the stone with his bare hand, tracing a line invisible to the rest, marking where the first cut would be made. This was not only a mark of geometry, but of intention, as if the stone itself needed to be told its purpose before it could be moved. The sound of the quarry was a music of its own. The high, sharp ping of copper chisels, the low groan of stones splitting under wooden wedges soaked in water, the rhythmic grunt of men pulling in unison. The air was thick with dust that clung to skin and hair, turning the workers pale, as if they too had been carved from limestone. Under the relentless sun, they sang to keep time, chants that rose and fell like the waves of the Nile, each verse tied to the work at hand. When a block was freed from its bed, it was as though a sentence had been spoken aloud for the first time. It was smoothed, measured, and then marked with small hidden signs, codes that told the builders at the site where it belonged in the structure. To an outsider, these marks were nothing, just a mason's tally. But to those who knew, they were the syllables of the Pharaoh's silent language. Transporting the stone was a feat of patience and will. The largest blocks were laid upon wooden sledges dragged over paths of wet sand, a technique that reduced friction but demanded constant labour. Along the route, water-bearers worked in shifts, their job as vital as that of the men pulling the ropes. Every mile, the stone seemed to grow heavier, and yet there was a strange reverence in the way the workers touched it, as if it were already part of a monument they could not see. At night, when the quarry was silent, the cut faces of the rock caught the moonlight, glowing faintly against the darkness. Those who slept nearby swore they could hear the stone cooling, its warmth slowly leaving it like the last breath of a living thing. In the stillness, it was possible to believe the blocks were storing not just the heat of the day, but the purpose they had been given, holding it deep within until it was time to release it into the hidden chamber. Granite, especially, seemed to carry a presence. Drawn from the quarries at Aswan, its deep rose and black specks shimmered faintly, when polished, as though it contained stars of its own. These stones were destined for the most important seals and thresholds, the ones that would bear the true weight of eternity. Working them was slow and exacting. Even the smallest error could ruin weeks of labour. Yet each successful cut was greeted not with loud celebration, but with a nod, a quiet acknowledgement that one more word in the Pharaoh's language had been spoken. As the months turned to years, the quarrymen noticed a change in the overseers. Their eyes scanned each block as though they were reading a message, and their hands lingered on certain pieces longer than necessary, feeling for something beyond texture or weight. The workers did not ask questions. In Egypt, stone was more than material. It was history's memory, the eternal witness to human intent. Whatever the overseers were building, it would be written not in ink, but in the enduring script of rock. And so, piece by piece, the syllables of the Pharaoh's secret language left the quarries. They travelled in silence across the desert, each block carrying not just its weight, but the meaning pressed into it by human hands and ancient belief. When at last they reached the hidden site, they would not simply become walls or floors. They would become a story that only the desert, the stars, and the Pharaoh himself could read. Beneath the desert floor, the air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of dust that had not moved for centuries. The first corridors were narrow, just wide enough for two men to walk side by side, their torches sending long shadows that seemed to lean in, listening. At first glance, they appeared to lead forward with purpose, but each step revealed the Pharaoh's true intent: misdirection. Every turn, every fork was a carefully constructed lie. The labyrinth had been conceived not simply as a barrier, but as a test, one designed to strip away certainty from those who entered uninvited. Some corridors curved subtly until they doubled back upon themselves, depositing the intruder where they had begun. Others narrowed gradually until a man could barely squeeze through, only to open into an empty alcove with nothing but bare stone walls. The Pharaoh had understood a truth older than his reign, confusion could be a stronger defense than any physical barrier. The builders had studied the movements of trespassers in other tombs, how they favoured the right-hand wall, how they quickened their pace in narrow spaces, how the flicker of light could play tricks on the eyes. Using these observations, they crafted illusions in stone. A corridor might appear to slope downward, encouraging a thief to hurry, only for the floor to rise subtly until he found himself climbing. Doorways led to staircases that descended into sealed wells, their water long since gone, leaving only darkness and the echo of footsteps. Some walls were carved with faint patterns, neither writing nor decoration, that could easily be mistaken for clues. To those who did not know, they were meaningless. To those who did, they were markers of the false paths, the equivalent of a whispered warning in the Pharaoh's hidden language. The true route to the inner chamber was never straight. It wove like the threads of a loom, crossing itself, unravelling and tightening again. The torchlight played its own role in the deception. The smooth limestone reflected light in uneven ways, creating the illusion of openings where there were none, or shadows where the path was clear. The mind of an intruder, already tense with the fear of being caught, would begin to doubt its own senses. Some would turn back, not because they found a barrier, but because they felt they were being led deeper into something they could not understand. The Pharaoh's architects had even accounted for sound. Certain bends in the corridors carried in distorted noises. A single footstep could seem to come from behind. A dropped pebble might echo from the wrong direction. In this way, the maze became not just a physical challenge, but a psychological one. Every sense was called into question, every moment of confidence undermined. Yet for the builders, these corridors were not traps, but poetry. Each false turn was a line in a verse, each dead end a deliberate pause, a silence in the composition. They knew the path in their bones, the way a shepherd knows the folds of a familiar hill, but they also knew that once their work was complete, they would never walk it again. For the Pharaoh, the labyrinth was more than protection, it was reflection. In the twisting corridors, he saw the winding path of his own life, the betrayals, the alliances, the hidden victories. The false turns were the court intrigues he had avoided, the dead ends were the ambitions of his enemies, stopped short. In this way, the maze became a mirror, a final expression of his cunning. And somewhere beyond all the turns and false doors, the true chamber waited. But to reach it required more than persistence. It required the one thing a thief could never possess, the Pharaoh's own mind. Without it, the corridors would lead only to the same place they began, empty-handed and surrounded by the unyielding silence of stone. Beyond the twisting corridors, past the false doors and empty chambers, there came at last a place where the air felt different, heavier, more expectant, as if it were waiting for something that would never come. Here stood the guardian's seal. It was not a soldier, not a beast, but a single slab of granite fitted so perfectly into the walls that it might have been grown there, rather than carved. Its surface was unbroken, without hinges, handles, or any sign of how it might yield. The seal was more than stone. It was an oath made solid, the final line drawn between the living and the dead. Before it was placed, the Pharaoh himself had stood in that space, the high priest at his side, the air thick with incense. They recited words not meant for mortal ears, invocations to the gods who watched over death, petitions for protection, and warnings to those who might one day stand where he stood now. The seal would not simply block entry, it would bind the chamber beyond to the will of the divine. The ritual of sealing was deliberate and slow. First, the threshold was washed with water from the Nile taken during the moment of sunrise, believed to carry the energy of beginnings. Then fine powders of lapis, malachite, and gold dust were scattered across it, each a symbol of power, eternity, and divine favour. Priests traced protective symbols on the floor and walls, their reed pens dipped in ink mixed with honey, so that the gods might taste the offering. Only then was the granite block lowered into place. Ropes creaked, wooden sledges groaned, and the workers, by themselves sworn to silence, eased the stone into its final position. The fit was exact. Not even the edge of a blade could slip between it and the frame of the doorway. Once in place, molten gypsum plaster was poured into the fine seams, binding the block as if it were part of the bedrock. When it cooled, it became indistinguishable from the surrounding wall. But the true guardianship of the seal was hidden inside it. The architects had devised mechanisms known only to them and the Pharaoh, channels drilled deep within the stone that would collapse if the block were forced, sending a cascade of sand and small stones into the corridor behind the intruder, sealing them inside. In some designs, narrow chambers above the seal contained vessels of resin and oil that, when broken, would pour down and ignite if touched by flame. Whether these measures were ever activated or remained only a threat, no one could say. For the people of the time, however, the greatest danger was not mechanical but spiritual. The guardian seal was said to be watched by Anubis himself, the jackal-headed god of the dead, who would weigh the heart of any who dared to break it. If found wanting, the intruder would not only die, but be denied entry to the afterlife, condemned to wander forever as a restless shadow. Tales spread of robbers who had broken into lesser tombs, only to be found lifeless days later, their eyes wide with terror, as if they had seen something no mortal should. The presence of the seal worked on the mind as much as the body. Even the most determined thief would pause before it, torchlight dancing on the unyielding granite, feeling the stillness press against their chest. It was said that, in the absolute quiet of that place, one could hear their own heart beat, as though it belonged to someone else. A reminder of how fragile they were in the presence of eternity. For the Pharaoh, the seal was not just a barrier, but a statement. It proclaimed that what lay beyond was not meant for the living. To reach this point was to approach the threshold of a mystery, and the seal was its final silent word: stop. And so it stood, year after year, century after century, the dust settling on its flawless surface, the air before it unmoving. The corridors behind it might twist and deceive, but the guardian seal did not play games. It waited, eternal, for a hand bold or foolish enough to challenge it. Long after the Pharaoh's voice had faded into the silence of the desert, long after the builders had been scattered to their own quiet ends, others came. They were men of shadows, walking not in processions of priests but in small silent groups, their eyes sharp, their hands restless. Tomb robbers, they were clever, patient, and unafraid to spend months, even years, searching for what they believed was hidden beneath the sand. Yet the tomb that the Pharaoh had envisioned, that the architects had built, was unlike anything they had ever faced. Some came with crude maps, half-remembered directions passed down by men who had once hauled stones in the desert. Others followed rumours whispered in the marketplaces of Thebes and Memphis, of a burial so rich it would make a man's grandchildren kings. By day they blended among the crowds, their speech full of harmless chatter. By night they moved toward the desert, wrapped in cloaks that muffled their steps, the flicker of their small torches hidden behind walls of cloth. Their first obstacle was always the land itself. The desert shifted, burying their markers, swallowing their tools. A single sandstorm could erase weeks of progress, leaving nothing but the endless rolling of dunes. More than one group wandered in circles until their water ran low, forced to turn back before they even found the first hint of stone. Those who were luckier, or more determined, sometimes found an opening, a collapsed shaft, a crack in the rock, a carved stone half revealed by the wind. They would descend into the darkness, the torchlight painting the walls in trembling gold. But here, the Pharaoh's cunning began to work against them. Corridors turned without reason, Dead ends forced them to double back, and false doors mocked them with seams that led nowhere. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, as though it too sought to hold them back. The robbers were not without skill. They tapped on walls, listening for hollows. They traced their fingers along the plaster for hidden seams. Some carried thin copper rods to probe the joints between stones. Yet the tomb's design anticipated them. A wall that seemed promising might lead only to a small chamber containing nothing but painted images, scenes of harvests and offerings, their colours dulled by time, their meanings lost to men who cared only for gold. There are tales of robber bands who reached the guardian's seal itself. In the wavering light of their torches, they would run their hands along its smooth granite face, muttering to one another, searching for any weakness. Some tried chisels, the stone barely chipped. Others poured oil into the seams, thinking to soften whatever bound it, but the gypsum seal drank it and remained unmoved. And always there was the silence, a silence so complete it seemed to listen back. The men spoke in whispers, their eyes flicking to the darkness behind them, until one would finally murmur that they should go. Fear took many forms in those passages. Some swore they heard footsteps behind them when none of their companions moved. Others felt a sudden drop in temperature, as if a shadow had passed directly through them. One account, told by an old man who had fled such a place in his youth, described how his torchlight suddenly dimmed, as though it had been swallowed by the darkness ahead. No matter how much oil he poured onto the flame, it would not brighten. He left that night without looking back, and never returned to the desert again. Centuries passed and still the tomb resisted. Each attempt left no more than a few scratches in the stone, a broken tool, or a frightened man swearing that the place was cursed. Even those who dismissed superstition found themselves turning away, their reason overcome by something they could not name. The Pharaoh's labyrinth, his seal, and the silence that guarded them proved stronger than greed, stronger even than desperation. In the end, the only treasure the robbers carried away was the memory of the torchlight dancing on painted walls, and the quickened pace of their own footsteps as they hurried back toward the night air, empty-handed and unsettled, their breath misting in the cool desert darkness. Once past the guardian's seal, a feat so rare it belongs more to legend than to fact, the intruder would step into a place unlike any other in the tomb. The chamber was not grand nor heavily decorated. At first glance it seemed almost plain, a rectangular space with smooth limestone walls and a floor polished to a muted sheen. But then the sound would begin. It was subtle at first, a faint sigh that seemed to drift from somewhere unseen, too low to be the wind, too steady to be imagination. Then it would deepen, filling the space with a rhythm like lungs inhaling and exhaling. The effect was immediate, a tightening in the chest, a quickening of the heart, a sudden suspicion that one was not alone. Even the most seasoned explorer would pause, torch held aloft, eyes darting to the corners as though expecting the stone itself to stir. The breath was no accident. It was the product of ingenious design, a trick of air and architecture conceived by the Pharaoh's architects. Small concealed shafts ran from this chamber to the upper layers of the tomb, some connecting to the hidden corridors beyond. Changes in temperature and pressure, especially between the cool of the tomb and the heat of the outer desert, caused air to move gently through these channels. The sound was amplified by the hollow spaces behind the walls, creating that uncanny rhythm. It was said that the builders had studied the way the wind sighed through temple colonnades at night, then reproduced it in stone. The chamber's acoustics were perfect for unsettling the mind. A footstep might echo twice as though repeated by something just out of sight. A whispered word could seem to travel along the walls and return from behind. In such a place, the torch's light did little to reassure. Every flicker seemed to catch movements. Every shadow seemed to grow longer. For the Pharaoh, the chamber of breath was not merely a trap. It was a guardian of perception. The sound was meant to unbalance, to make the intruder doubt the safety of every step forward. In the culture of his time, breath was life, the car, the vital essence. To hear breathing in a place of the dead was to be reminded that one stood at the edge of realms, trespassing in a space where the living and the dead might meet. Yet for all its menace, the chamber contained nothing of obvious value. No gold, no carved altar, no painted scenes of the Pharaoh's reign. This emptiness was deliberate. It was a false victory, a place to convince the greedy that they'd reached the heart of the tomb, and to leave them unsatisfied, their nerves frayed, ready to turn back. Still, the room was not without meaning. The smooth walls bore faint, almost invisible carvings, patterns of waves, spirals, and lines that curved like the paths of desert winds. These were not hieroglyphs, but symbols, perhaps meant only for the pharaoh himself. Some scholars have argued they represented the breath of the gods, a cosmic wind carrying the soul from one world to the next. Others believe they were instructions in a visual code, guiding only those who already knew what to look for. The floor, too, concealed its own secret. One slab, indistinguishable from the rest, was a door in disguise. It seemed so fine they could not be seen without bending close. Beneath it lay a narrow shaft, steep and unlit, leading down into deeper darkness. This was the true path forward, the threshold to the inner sanctum. Only those who knew of it, or those willing to crawl on their hands and knees, tapping the floor for hollow sounds, would find it. It is easy to imagine an intruder reaching this chamber, after hours of navigating the labyrinth, his body tired, his mind raw from the constant unease. The breathing sound would wrap around him. The emptiness would mock him, and the thought of descending further into blackness might break his resolve. In most cases, it did. Many turned back here, carrying away only the memory of the strange chamber that seemed alive. For the pharaoh, that was enough. The chamber of breath was not meant to kill or to capture, but to send the unworthy away. It was the pause before the truth, the final test before the last secret. And in the centuries that followed, the sound continued, long after its makers were dust. A slow, eternal inhaling and exhaling in the dark, as if the tomb itself was waiting to speak. Beyond the chamber of breath, in a corner that seemed no different from the others, stood the true last door, though to call it a door would be misleading. To the unknowing eye, it was simply part of the wall, a continuous expanse of polished limestone without hinges, handles, or even the faintest seam. It did not invite entry. It did not even suggest that entry was possible, and that was its greatest strength. The pharaoh's architects had designed it to be invisible, in plain sight. The limestone was cut from the same quarry as the surrounding walls, its colour and texture identical. The surface was polished to match the exact sheen of the chamber, so that torchlight rolled across it without pause. The edges were beveled so subtly that they blended perfectly into the joints of the stone blocks around it, hiding the fact that this single slab could move at all. Yet there were signs, if you knew where to look. Signs not written for the casual observer, but for the sworn keepers of the tomb's design. Along one edge of the stone, a barely perceptible ripple in the carving matched a similar ripple on the opposite wall, forming a pair. The patterns were meaningless to anyone else, but to the initiated, they marked the pivot points of the hidden hinges. The hinges themselves were concealed deep within the masonry, crafted from bronze so pure it resisted the centuries without crumbling to green dust. Opening the door required not just knowledge, but precision. A small depression in the floor, invisible unless the torchlight struck it at just the right angle, was the key. Pressing a weighted foot upon it released a counterweight inside the wall, disengaging a locking bar. Without this step, the door would remain as unmoving as the bedrock itself. Those who attempted to force it would trigger the other element of the design, the pressure traps. These traps were marvels of ancient engineering. The stone directly above the doorway concealed a narrow channel filled with loose granite chips. If the door was struck or levered from the wrong point, the channel would open, pouring the chips down like an avalanche, enough to crush bones and block the passage permanently. In other versions of the design, perhaps never used, perhaps only whispered of, clay jars filled with fine desert sand were balanced in hidden alcoves above the chamber. Once broken, they would spill their contents into concealed side shafts, triggering a slow collapse of the floor beneath the intruder's feet. It is said the craftsmen who made the true last door worked in near silence. They understood the weight of what they were building, not just a barrier, but the threshold to the Pharaoh's deepest secret. Each block around the doorway was carved with obsessive care, each seam adjusted until no blade could pass through it. When at last the door swung for the first time, it moved so smoothly that it seemed to float. Only the low groan of the hidden hinges betrayed that anything in the wall had changed at all. Once set into place, the door was tested again and again under the eyes of the architects. The mechanisms were inspected, the balance weights adjusted, the traps armed. When they were satisfied, the door was closed for what might be the last time in centuries. The seam lines were brushed with powdered limestone until they vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but an unbroken surface. For the uninvited, the true last door was the final deception, a blank wall where hope should be. For those who knew its secrets, it was the quietest of invitations, a hidden threshold between the living world and the Pharaoh's eternal sanctuary. To cross it was to leave behind all doubt, all danger, all tests of loyalty. Beyond it lay not a maze nor a trap, but the still heart of the Pharaoh's design. And so the door waited, year upon year, century upon century, blending into the silence of the chamber. It was patient, as stone always is, knowing that only the worthy, or the impossibly lucky, would ever see it move again. And the true last door, once opened, did not reveal the blinding glitter of gold or the dense perfume of cedar chests filled with jewels. Instead, the air that spilled out was cool, dry, and faintly scented with the dust of centuries. The torchlight that followed revealed a chamber of restraint, a space not designed to dazzle, but to endure. Here the Pharaoh had left offerings, yes, but not of the kind that thieves or even kings would covet. These were things meant for the journey beyond, and for conversations not with the living, but with the gods. Along the walls, carved shelves held tightly rolled scrolls bound with leather cords, their surfaces darkened with age. They were not the formal proclamations of state, nor the histories, carved in temple stone. Instead, these were personal writings, prayers, meditations, perhaps even letters to those who had gone before him. The ink, now faded to a soft brown, had been applied in a hand that seemed more intimate than official, as though these words had been meant to be spoken softly into the air rather than read aloud in court. Beside the scrolls lay tools, not ceremonial replicas, but well-used objects. A bronze adze, its handle polished smooth by years of touch, a set of measuring rods marked with notches, the kind used by architects and surveyors, a small stone chisel, its edge still sharp, resting in a wooden box lined with linen. These were not symbols of rule, but of creation. Perhaps the Pharaoh wished to take with him not the spoils of conquest, but the means to build again in the next life. In one corner stood a small chest of carved acacia wood, unadorned except for a single knot-shaped clasp. Within were items that spoke of a quieter, more human life. A game board with pieces of ivory and ebony, a small vial of perfume whose scent still lingered faintly when the stopper was lifted, and a folded piece of linen embroidered with a pattern so worn it was impossible to say what it had once depicted. These were the objects of memory, tokens perhaps from moments of peace amid the burdens of power. There were no great statues here, no towering guardians of stone. Instead, a series of small figurines lined a low shelf, each carved with a level of detail that suggested a personal connection. A shepherd with his flock, a boatman holding a reed pole, a woman grinding grain, her posture bent in the way of those who work for hours without pause. These were the faces of ordinary life, immortalized not for the sake of art, but for companionship, as if the Pharaoh intended to walk with them in the fields of the afterlife. Most intriguing were the objects whose purpose was unclear: a small disc of polished obsidian etched with a spiral that seemed to pull the eye inward, a narrow strip of beaten copper engraved on both sides with symbols not found in any known script, a fragment of carved stone showing only the curve of a wing, the rest of the figure lost. These things resisted interpretation, as though their meaning had been made deliberately opaque to all but the one who had placed them there. And everywhere, the chamber bore the marks of deliberate absence. There was space for more, shelves left half empty, niches without statues. It was as though the Pharaoh had chosen not to fill the room completely, leaving room for the unknown, for what he might yet acquire in the next world. This restraint was, in its own way, as striking as the absence of gold. It suggested a man who understood the impermanence of possessions, even in eternity. To a thief, such a room would be a disappointment. To a scholar, it would be a revelation. Here was a ruler who defined wealth not by the weight of precious metals, but by the intimacy of his tools, the memory in his tokens, and the secrecy of the objects whose meaning he took with him into the silence. In leaving these offerings, he had given the gods, and himself, not treasures, but truths. And perhaps that was the greatest act of all, to hide not gold from the hands of robbers, but the very meaning of what he valued, so that only in the divine might truly understand. Among the quiet offerings in the chamber, one object seemed to hold the air around it in stillness: a carved stone tablet, no larger than a man's chest, propped on a low stand of cedar. It was unlike anything else in the room. Where the other artifacts whispered of daily life, craftsmanship, and private devotion, this one spoke in the language of horizons. By the wavering light of a torch, its surface revealed a network of lines, curves, and shapes that were unmistakably geographic, yet they did not match the Egypt known to his time. The carving was meticulous. The Nile was there, yes, flowing like a lifeline down the tablet's centre, widening toward the delta and the great green sea beyond. But beyond those familiar waters were coastlines that bent in unfamiliar arcs, islands scattered like beads, and what appeared to be a great inland sea surrounded by markings that no scholar of the Pharaoh's age could have recognised. Along the lower edge of the tablet, faint etchings suggested mountains, ranges too far beyond the boundaries of the two lands to have been recorded in any royal archive. No accompanying inscription explained it. The symbols along the edges were a strange hybrid, part hieroglyph, part something else. Certain signs repeated in patterns, but they belonged to no known list in the scribe's repertoire. Theories abound among modern scholars that the Pharaoh had in his possession an inherited map from a much older civilization, that these shapes recorded journeys taken in dreams or visions, or that the tablet was a work of pure imagination meant to guide his soul in the afterlife. The more one studies the piece, the more deliberate it feels. The coastlines are too precise to be decorative. The curves of the rivers, the placement of the islands, they possess the kind of order that suggests observation, not invention. And yet how could such places have been known? Egypt's sailors, skilled as they were, hugged the shorelines of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. The distant lands shown here would have required journeys far beyond the reach of the reed boats and cedar ships of his time. Some have suggested that the map may depict lands as they once were, not as they were in the Pharaoh's day. The placement of certain river mouths and bays hints at coastlines altered by time, erosion, or flood. A few bold voices proposed that the map might show the world before the great shifts of water and land, a memory from a time when the sea stood lower or higher than in recorded history. If so, the Pharaoh was guarding not only his body, but a fragment of Earth's deeper memory. Others believe it to be a spiritual guide. In the religion of the time, the afterlife was a journey. The soul travelled through fields, rivers, gates and caverns, facing trials and guardians along the way. Perhaps this map was not of the living world at all, but of the Duat, the unseen realm of the dead. The unknown coastlines could represent boundaries between stages of the soul's passage. The great inland sea, a sacred crossing where the gods themselves ferried the worthy. There is even the possibility that the map came to Egypt from traders or wanderers who spoke of distant lands. The pharaoh, fascinated by the thought of a world beyond his empire, may have commissioned a record to preserve such tales. The blending of scripts could then be the result of translating foreign words into a form his scribes could capture. If that is true, then the tablet is not merely a curiosity. It is one of the earliest hints that Egypt's kings looked outward, far beyond their borders, toward a global horizon. Whatever its origin, its presence in the last chamber was no accident. Positioned alone, without competing objects nearby, it seemed to command attention. It was as if the pharaoh had placed it there to be found, not by robbers, but by someone who would recognize its significance. Or perhaps he meant for it never to be understood, a puzzle whose answer would remain his alone in eternity. The torchlight's glow played over its surface, catching on the shallow grooves of rivers and bays. In that flickering moment, the line seemed almost to move, as if water lapped against unseen shores, as if wind blew over distant mountains. And one could almost believe that the pharaoh, in his final rest, held not only the memory of his own land, but the outline of a world that lay beyond Egypt's reach, a world whose truth might still be drifting, just out of sight, waiting to be found. In a niche cut deep into the rear wall of the chamber, resting on a pedestal of smooth alabaster, stood a set of 4 canopic jars. At first glance, they seemed no different from the kind found in the tombs of other pharaohs, vessels meant to hold the preserved organs of the deceased, each guarded by the head of a protective deity. Yet one jar stood apart. The other 3 were familiar. The human-headed Imseti, guardian of the liver, the falcon-headed Kebesenuef, protector of the intestines, and the jackal-headed Duamutef, keeper of the stomach. But the 4th, where Hapi, the baboon-headed god, would usually guard the lungs, was something entirely different. Its lid bore no head at all, but a closed lotus blossom, its petals so finely carved that they seemed ready to open at a touch. Around its base were symbols no scholar could easily read. They resembled hieroglyphs in form, but not in meaning, curves and strokes that felt ancient yet foreign, like a language from the edges of memory. The jar's body was made of a dark stone, perhaps basalt, polished to a deep sheen that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Unlike the others, it bore no scenes of offerings or protective spells. Instead, the surface was marked by a spiral pattern, continuous and unbroken, as though meant to draw the eye inward toward the jar's heart. What it contained has been the subject of endless speculation. Some believe it truly held the pharaoh's heart, removed and preserved according to tradition, but placed in a vessel unlike any other to signify its singular importance. In Egyptian belief, the heart was the seat of thought, emotion, and moral worth, the part of the soul weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the Hall of Judgment. If the pharaoh's heart lay within, the strange symbols may have been intended to shield it from even the god's scrutiny, ensuring his passage into the afterlife without challenge. Others argue that the jar may have held not flesh at all, but something far more symbolic, a relic of power, perhaps an amulet or charm imbued with the pharaoh's authority, meant to guide him in the realm beyond. The spiral design could represent the eternal journey of the soul, winding inward toward the divine. In this theory, the jar was less a container for preservation and more a vessel of transformation, holding the essence of the pharaoh's will. There are those who whisper of more personal contents, a lock of hair from a lost love, a small letter written in the pharaoh's own hand, a fragment of a place dear to him, a stone from his birthplace, a handful of sand from the banks of the Nile, where he first took an oath of rule. In this telling, the jar was not about power or ritual, but about memory. the one thing even kings cannot command to stay. A few more adventurous scholars have suggested that the symbols on the jar might be a cipher, a code that could reveal its contents without opening it. So far, no one has succeeded in reading them. The patterns defy the logic of Egyptian writing, looping and repeating in ways that seem to follow a rhythm more like music than speech. Perhaps they were never meant to be read at all, only to be felt, their meaning locked in the act of tracing them with the fingers. Whatever lay within, the jar remained untouched through the centuries, its seal unbroken. There is something in its presence, a quiet gravity, that warns against disturbing it. Even the robbers who might have smashed other vessels for the gold or precious oils inside seem to have passed it by. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps the Pharaoh's seal upon it was not one that could be seen, but one that could be felt, a silent command that it should remain whole until the end of time. And so it stands, the heart's jar, its contents a mystery held between stone and silence. Whether it holds flesh, memory, power, or something beyond all three, it remains the most intimate offering of all, a piece of the Pharaoh himself, hidden where only the gods might ever see. On a low pedestal in the farthest corner of the chamber, away from the shelves of scrolls and the solemn weight of the heart's jar, lay an object so modest it could easily be overlooked. It was not locked in a chest, nor guarded by seals. It rested in the open, in the quiet way of something that had never needed to defend its worth. At first glance, it was not a crown at all, but a simple circlet woven from reeds. Their once green strands now faded to the pale hue of ancient straw, yet intact despite the centuries. There was no gold here, no inlaid gemstones to catch the light of a torch. The reeds were bound with strips of plant fibre, their pattern simple but precise, each crossing strand placed with a craftsman's patience. Time had drained them of their colour, but not of their shape. They still curved in an unbroken ring, as if waiting to rest again on the brow of the one who had worn them. A faint scent lingered, not of decay, but of river water and sun-warmed banks. Why would a pharaoh, a man whose brow had once borne the weight of gold, lapis and turquoise, choose to be buried with a crown like this? The question has sparked as much speculation as any treasure in the tomb. One theory holds that it was a symbol from his youth. Perhaps before he was pharaoh, he had been crowned with such a circlet in a small, private ceremony, a local festival or a family rite by the Nile's edge. In those days, reeds were woven for games, for blessings, for the coronation of festival kings who reigned for a day in jest. To keep such a crown into his final rest might have been a way of holding on to the boy he once was, before the weight of empire pressed on his shoulders. Another possibility is more symbolic. Gold endures, but it is heavy. Reeds are light, and they grow again each year. In choosing a crown of reeds over a crown of gold, perhaps the pharaoh wished to remind the gods, and himself, that he was not only a ruler, but a man of the earth, tied to its cycles, dependent on the river's flood as much as the poorest farmer. A crown of reeds is not a declaration of power, but of belonging. Some have suggested the crown may have been woven for him by someone he loved, a child, a wife, a trusted companion. Its preservation in the tomb would then be an act of devotion, a quiet defiance of the grandeur expected of kings. In a chamber filled with carefully crafted deceptions and guarded secrets, this single unadorned object might be the truest statement of all. That beyond the throne, beyond the labyrinth, beyond the seals and traps, there was a man who valued a simple gift above all riches. The craftsmanship, though humble in material, reveals great care. Each reed was cut young, when the stems are supple, then dried and resoftened in water before weaving. The binding fibres are knotted in a way that would hold for centuries without loosening. That it survived the arid centuries intact is a testament both to the skill of its maker and the conditions of the tomb. The air perfectly still, the temperature constant, the light absent except for the rare flicker of a torch. Its position in the chamber suggests significance. It was not placed among the tools or the scrolls, nor with the ritual vessels. Instead it sat alone, as if in quiet honour, free from the shadows of other relics. No inscription marked it, no carving explained its presence. It did not need explanation. In many ways, this crown is the key to understanding the man who built this hidden world. His labyrinth, his seals, his empty decoy chambers, all were acts of cunning and control. But this crown was neither cunning nor controlling. It was the opposite, a surrender to simplicity, a piece of his life without artifice. In the end, the Pharaoh seems to have wanted to be remembered not only for the empire he ruled, but for the riverbank boy who once bent over the reeds, hearing the rush of the Nile and smelling the sharp sweetness of green stems. Perhaps when the gods weighed his heart, he hoped they would see this crown and remember that he had walked the earth as a man before he sat on the throne as a king. Perhaps this was his way of telling them, I am not bringing my gold, my armies, my monuments. I am bringing myself. And in that choice, more than in all the treasure hidden away, he left the truest offering of all. The deeper one looks into the Pharaoh's last chamber, the more it becomes clear that stone alone was not its measure. It was not only built to endure, it was built to converse with the sky. The air inside was still, the darkness complete. Yet the walls and ceiling seemed to remember the stars. Every line, every angle whispered of a design that reached beyond the desert, beyond the sunlit horizon, into the slow, eternal turning of the heavens. At first glance, the chamber appeared sealed from the world above, but subtle features betrayed another story. Narrow shafts, barely wide enough for a man's arm, pierced the walls at precise angles. These were not for air. Their paths were too deliberate, too exact. When traced in the mind's eye, they rose through the mass of stone and sand to emerge in the open night. Their mouths positioned so that, on certain nights of the year, a single star would shine directly down into the chamber. One such shaft, aligned with Sopdet, the star we now call Sirius, whose rising marked the annual flooding of the Nile, the event upon which all life in Egypt depended. To the ancient mind, Sopdet was not just a star, but a goddess, herald of renewal, the one who opened the year. For the Pharaoh to align his chamber with her was to tie his soul's rebirth to the rebirth of the land itself. Another shaft pointed toward Sar, the constellation we now know as Orion, sacred to Osiris, lord of the dead and eternal king of the afterlife. On certain nights, the star Alnitak in Orion's belt would hang perfectly in the shaft's line, as though a bridge of light connected the Pharaoh's resting place to the throne of Osiris himself. In that moment, the tomb ceased to be merely a chamber. It became a cosmic doorway. The walls too followed celestial order. The long axis of the chamber was set not by convenience or the lay of the land, but by the path of the sun at the equinox, the moment of perfect balance between day and night. It was as if the Pharaoh wished to place himself in that eternal balance, ready to step from one world to another when the heavens allowed. Even the dimensions of the chamber bore ratios found in the cycles of the moon, as though its very proportions could echo the rhythm of celestial time. Some scholars have speculated that these alignments served a ritual purpose at the time of burial. Imagine the moment, the body laid to rest, the chamber still open, the high priests waiting in silence for the right star to appear in the shaft's opening. When it did, the light would have touched the Pharaoh's body, a final blessing before the door was sealed forever. In that single ray, sky and earth would meet, binding the two realms together. It is tempting to think of this as mere superstition, but to the ancient Egyptians the stars were not distant, lifeless points. They were eternal beings, the souls of the blessed dead, the companions of the gods. To align one's final home with them was to set one's course into eternity, to ensure that when the car, the life force, rose from the body, it would have a road to follow. Perhaps this was the Pharaoh's truest safeguard. Gold could be stolen, seals could be broken, walls could be breached, but the path of the stars could not be altered by mortal hands. No thief could take Orion from the sky, no sandstorm could dim Sirius. Long after the corridors filled with dust and the names of the builders were forgotten, the stars would still rise and set in their appointed places, guiding the Pharaoh's soul on the journey he had planned for it. And so the chamber was more than a tomb. It was a map drawn in stone, a compass set not to the shifting sands, but to the immutable dance of the heavens. In life, the Pharaoh had ruled the land between two deserts. In death, he sought to reign over a far greater kingdom, the infinite, glittering expanse of the night sky. When the farthest corner of the Pharaoh's last chamber, where the torchlight would fall only if one deliberately turned toward it, there is a single mark. Not a royal cartouche, not the name of a god, but the name of a man, a scribe. It is carved small, no larger than the length of a hand, and its lines are clean but unadorned. The hieroglyphs speak plainly. His name, and nothing more. No titles, no boasts, just the trace of the one who bore the heaviest of burdens, to remember and to leave behind nothing else of himself. That it exists at all is remarkable. The Pharaoh's orders for secrecy had been absolute. No artisan, no builder, no attendant was to leave their mark upon the work. All who laboured here would do so as shadows, their skill absorbed into the stone, their presence erased by design. Yet at the very end, the scribe was permitted, or perhaps allowed himself, this single moment of permanence. The scribe's task had been unlike that of any other. He had carried the Pharaoh's instructions in his mind alone, committing every measurement, every alignment, every sequence of the burial rites to memory. There had been no scrolls, no written diagrams to guide the builders. His was the only living record, and he had walked among the workers with quiet authority, ensuring each element was placed exactly as the Pharaoh intended. In many ways, the tomb was as much his creation as theirs. We can imagine his final day in the chamber. The offerings were in place, the last stones fitted, the hinges of the true last door oiled and closed. The air was still and heavy, as though even the dust held its breath. The priests had finished their chants, their voices low and resonant, their words spiralling upward into the darkness above. One by one, the workers withdrew, carrying their tools and torches, leaving the scribe behind with a handful of others, those entrusted with sealing the chamber. Perhaps he lingered after the others had gone, standing in the centre of the room, letting his eyes travel over the objects he would never see again. The scrolls on their shelves, the heart's jar quiet in its niche, the crown of reeds resting in its corner, as if waiting for a hand to lift it, the carved map of unknown lands. He had touched them all, arranged them all, and now he would give them to the care of the desert and the gods. In the silence he stepped to the corner and knelt. The stone was cool beneath his palm. With the point of a chisel, he carved his name into the wall, not for recognition, but perhaps for witness. It was the simplest statement he could make. I was here. I saw this. I kept the oath. Each stroke was deliberate, the sound sharp in the stillness. When it was done, he brushed the stone dust away and set down the chisel. Then came the closing. The granite block of the guardian's seal was lowered into place, its seams sealed with gypsum. The labyrinth behind it was left empty, its false doors standing silent. In the chamber, the scribe's footsteps were the last to echo. As he passed through the true last door, it swung shut behind him with a muted groan, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the stone. From there, it was a slow ascent through the passageways, each one blocked in turn until only a narrow path remained. Finally, the last opening to the desert was closed, and the final stones set. No light would enter that space again. No living thing would walk those floors or breathe that air or trace the spirals on the heart's jar with curious fingers. The Pharaoh's last chamber had become what it was always meant to be, a place of absolute silence. The scribe stepping out into the sunlight must have felt the weight of the air change, the heat of the desert pressed against his skin, the sky a brilliant, blinding blue after so long in the dim. Behind him, the sand already began its slow work, brushing against the newly sealed entrance, smoothing away the marks of labour. He knew that the path would vanish soon, hidden by the desert's shifting hand, and in that moment, perhaps, he felt both pride and loss. Pride for having completed the work as the Pharaoh had commanded, sealing the secret so thoroughly that even the centuries might fail to uncover it. Loss for knowing he had left behind something beautiful, something made with care and devotion, never to be seen again, except perhaps by the gods. His name remains, small and unassuming, in that far corner, the only human trace permitted, and so long as the chamber endures, so too will that quiet farewell. Silence settled like a second masonry, layer upon layer, until it too became part of the architecture. When the last footsteps faded and the final seam was smoothed to the colour of the wall, the chamber entered its long sleep. No flame breathed there, no voice trespassed, only the soft, invisible weather of dust, drifting, settling, lifting, and settling again, marked the passage of time. Each grain took its place with the patience of centuries, a quiet snowfall in a world without wind. The tomb learned the rhythm of itself. Stone held its own temperature, cool even when the desert above burned white. Linen kept its fold, wood released the ghost of its fragrance, and then stilled. Metals dulled by degrees too small for the living eye to measure. In that contained air, the offerings did not age so much as they deepened, as if the absence of disturbance allowed them to become more themselves. The scrolls exhaled their last traces of ink and resin, and then were content to exist as silence made visible. Sometimes, from far away in the body of the earth, a tremor passed like a fingertip over the surface of a drum. The chamber felt it and answered with the faintest conversation of joints and seams, a murmur of reassurance between stone and stone. Very slowly, mineral bloom formed in tiny halos at contact points, delicate salts like frost rings, the mathematics of stillness playing out in her chalk-pale geometry. They grew, receded, grew again, so slowly that a century was only the difference between a breath and the next. Above, the world changed costumes. Dynasties rose and lowered their standards to the wind. New kings named themselves with old names. Ships learned bolder paths along coasts the tablet had traced in. Quiet torchlit grooves. A different language was spoken in the markets, then another after that, and laughter remained the same under all of them. Pilgrims left offerings on other stones. Armies crossed the river with banners that were beautiful for a season and then forgotten. The desert remembered everything and displayed nothing. Night after night, stars turned their flawless machinery overhead. Sirius ripened on its appointed mornings. Orion shouldered winter on and off like a cloak. The shafts that had been cut to greet those lights continued their vigil, and on the few, exact nights when heaven aligned with masonry, a thread of starlight touched down the hidden conduits and lay weightless on a wall that could not know it was being blessed. No hand was there to witness it, but blessing does not require witnesses. Creatures of the sand tested the boundary between their world and the Pharaoh's. Beetles traced brief hieroglyphs on the surface of dunes and erased themselves the same hour. A fox nosed a seam and lost interest. A blind pale moth wandered a fissure and found the air too still to trust. The stone declined all invitations. Where the corridors rose to meet the realm of wind and moon, the labyrinth tightened its comprehension and became once more a vocabulary of refusals. Even the idea of intrusion thinned with each generation that forgot how to imagine it. The chamber's contents arranged their dialogue in the only tents left to them. The bronze adze rested in a geometry of shadow that slowly changed shape by imperceptible increments of dust. The reed crown, light as a solved riddle, continued to be exactly itself, a circle with memory of river music sewn into its fibres. The heart's jar kept its seal the way a singer keeps a note in her chest. The carved map did not alter, but the meanings one might have read upon it rose and fell in the outer world like distant tides. To the gods who do not mistrust quiet, this was speech enough. Now and then, in the many lives of the sand, a storm unscrolled itself with theatre. Grains hissed, dunes marched, horizons were remade with a flourish. Above the chamber, weight shifted and then smoothed, but below, the air moved only by the width of ideas. A few grains found thin crypts in the masonry, settled as scouts, and never reported back. The mechanisms in the door waited like disciplined soldiers long after the trumpet has gone out of fashion. Calendars turned and turned again. A scholar somewhere wrote a treatise, lost it, rewrote it better. A boy on a riverbank learned to throw a net and kept a reed ring for a summer game before forgetting it in the grass. A woman told a story about a king whose tomb no one could find. Her daughter told it better. Her granddaughter changed the ending. Across centuries, rumour lifted a corner of the desert, like a veil, and let it fall. And still the chamber lay as it had been arranged, not disdaining the world, only disengaged from it. Silence does not mean nothingness. It is full of held notes, of intentions that have chosen endurance over display. The Pharaoh had wanted this. Not the loud immortality of monuments, but the soft kind that requires the earth's complicity. His secret was not a challenge to the living, but a contract with time. The builders honoured their oath. The scribe's name, no taller than a hand, kept company with the dark for so long that even memory learned to walk barefoot there. On certain nights, when the temperature of stone and air matched like two halves of a thought, the chamber of breath far above gave its small patient music. Inhale, exhale, as if the tomb practiced being alive, so it would never forget what to do when the soul came back to consult it. The true last door dozed with the dignity of a sentinel who trusts his post. Dust rehearsed falling, then perfected, it fell. Empires met their evenings, new faiths charted their constellations of meaning. Histories were corrected, and then corrected again, each version confident until it wasn't. The desert put a hand over its own mouth and smiled with its eyes. The chamber waited, not for discovery exactly, but for the fulfillment of its design, which included the possibility that no one would ever learn it had existed. That too is a kind of completion, and yet as centuries resolved into more centuries, a different gravity began to gather at the edges of the map of human curiosity. Questions learned to travel farther than caravans. Instruments taught themselves to be steadier than hands. The habit of looking beneath surfaces acquired better lenses. Somewhere in the future's throat, a small clearing of voice prepared itself. The sound people make when about to say, "What if?" Until then, the chamber kept its watch. Stone listened to stone. The offerings agreed to outlast their questions. The last lights to touch that room were the ones the priests had let down the shafts for ritual's sake. The next lights, whenever they came, would arrive with a different kind of reverence and a similar kind of hush. Above, a morning was always rising. Below, the Pharaoh's secret, held like a star under sand, not gone, only patiently not seen. It began, as many rediscoveries do, not with a grand announcement, but with a whisper. In the archives of a provincial museum, a young researcher turned over a forgotten notebook, its pages brittle, its script a mixture of hurried hieratic and scattered sketches. The handwriting belonged to a 19th century surveyor who had travelled Egypt's deserts in the service of a European consulate. Among his otherwise mundane entries, measurements of river bends, accounts of livestock, was a brief note that stood apart. Stone face in hollow of dune, too even to be natural. No time to examine further. That single line lodged itself in the mind of the researcher, who began quietly collecting every mention, however fleeting, of unusual formations in the region described. Some came from colonial officers, some from Bedouin guides whose families told stories of a place where the sand breathes, and one from a 1930s cartographer who had marked a blank patch of desert with a solitary question mark. It was enough to form a theory, and a small expedition was planned, discreetly, for in archaeology, the greatest treasures are often found by those who draw the least attention. They arrived under a pale winter sun, when the desert's heat was mild and its winds calm. The team numbered only 6. 2 archaeologists, 3 local labourers whose families had worked on digs for generations, and a geologist who understood the moods of the land. The first days were spent walking the terrain, learning its surface language, the ripples of the dunes, the scars of old riverbeds, the stubborn protrusions of bedrock. They found nothing at first, nothing that spoke louder than the sand's habitual shifting. It was the youngest labourer who noticed it, a slight depression in the leeward side of a dune, where the grain settled differently, as though caught on an edge just beneath. Brushing it with his hand revealed the faintest line, straight, precise, unsoftened by the wind. Stone, and not the fractured randomness of natural rock, but a cut surface. The work that followed was slow and deliberate. The archaeologists knew that haste was the enemy here. The sands had waited centuries, and to rush their unwrapping would be to lose the very story they were trying to read. Day by day, they scraped away the layers, first with shovels, then with brushes, then with tools no larger than a thumbnail. The stone face grew, a wall fitted with joints so fine that no root or water had entered them. The geologist studied the orientation and noted that it aligned almost exactly with the winter solstice sunrise. It was an intentional face, part of something larger hidden beneath. As they worked deeper, the wall gave way to an opening, choked with sand, but unmistakably a passage. The first few feet were filled with compacted grains, so hard-packed they might as well have been mortar. Clearing them was an exercise in patience, each scoop revealing more of the carefully laid stone beneath. Inside, the air was cool, dry and still. It carried a faint scent, not decay but the mineral tang of long undisturbed space. Their torches picked out the edges of a corridor, the walls smooth and close. Every step forward felt like an intrusion into something that had never expected visitors again. The silence pressed in on them, a reminder that they were walking into a place built for someone else's eternity. The labyrinth began almost immediately. Corridors that bent without warning, false doors carved with deceptive care, alcoves that led nowhere. The archaeologists marked their route meticulously, mapping each turn, each dead end. They felt the intelligence behind the stone, the way it seemed to anticipate them, to slow their progress with deliberate puzzles. Every so often, the sound of their own movements, a foot scuff, the scrape of a tool, would echo strangely, coming back from an angle that made them glance over their shoulders. Days turned into weeks, supplies were hauled in along narrow trails, and the team learned the rhythm of the desert. Early starts, midday pauses when the sun burned too bright, evenings spent reviewing sketches by lantern light. They had passed what they thought was the main barrier when they encountered it. The Guardian's seal, its granite face unbroken, exactly as it had been set millennia ago. It took them 2 days just to clear it fully from the sand, their fingers tracing the cool perfection of its surface. The seal was not breached lightly. For hours they studied the seams, the plaster, the stone's balance within its frame. When at last they disengaged the lock, it moved with a reluctant groan, like an ancient door waking from sleep. Beyond it lay the chamber of breath, just as the builders had intended. The faint, rhythmic sigh rising from unseen shafts, unnerving in the glow of modern torchlight. They paused there, listening, feeling the strange sensation of being both the first and not the first to stand in that place. Then slowly, they moved onward, careful, as though walking in the company of the dead. Their brushes whispered over stone, revealing carvings untouched since the last hand set them down. Dust fell in delicate veils, catching the light as if reluctant to leave its home. In those moments, the centuries collapsed. The chamber's silence, the corridor's twists, the seal's weight, all the layers of intention laid by the Pharaoh and his builders were still there, undiminished. And the archaeologists, for all their tools and science, felt the same awe and caution as any intruder before them. They were not merely uncovering stone. They were entering the conversation the Pharaoh had begun with the desert itself, a dialogue meant to last forever. The tomb had been found, but its secret was still waiting to be understood. It happened quietly, without the thunder of stone collapsing or the drama of cinematic legend. The final barrier gave way with a sigh, not unlike the soft exhale of someone rising from deep sleep, and a faint draught touched their faces. It was cool, impossibly dry, and tinged with something that did not belong to the world outside. The air of the Pharaoh's last chamber had been sealed longer than memory itself. Now it was meeting the present. For a moment, no one moved. The torches burned steadily, their flames undisturbed, but each member of the team felt the change. It was not a rush or a gust, more a slow meeting of atmospheres, like two strangers exchanging cautious greetings after a long separation. Somewhere behind them, the desert wind shifted, and that movement, however distant, eventually found its way down the corridors to mingle with the breath of centuries. The archaeologists would later speak of a scent that was hard to name. It was not decay, nothing in the chamber had rotted in the dry, sealed stillness. It was more like the mineral sharpness of stone warmed and cooled 1,000 times, layered with the faintest trace of oils and resins, and something older still, the smell of absence given form. Inhaling it felt like stepping into a time that had not been eroded by history. The light pushed forward first, pooling gently over the floor, climbing the walls until it revealed the curve of a shelf, the gleam of worked stone, the shadow of objects waiting in their places. This was not the violent entry of looters. This was the slow, deliberate unveiling of a scene that had been waiting patiently to resume its story. For the team, the moment carried a weight they could not easily speak of. They were trained to measure, to document, to keep the heart separate from the work. Yet here, standing on the threshold, they could not help but feel the enormity of what had happened. The Pharaoh's last breath, or what remained of it, was now mingled with theirs. Millennia had dissolved into the same narrow span of air. One of the archaeologists stepped forward, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the fine dust that had lain undisturbed since the last living person left the chamber. The sound of that first footfall was strangely loud, as though the stone were acknowledging the return of human presence. A second step, then another, each one a small negotiation with the past. Inside, the air seemed to hold its own gravity. The flicker of the torchlight revealed the shelves, the scrolls, the tools, the quiet dignity of the heart's jar in its niche. Even without touching anything, they could feel the presence of intention in the placement of every object. The room was not cluttered, it was curated, as though the Pharaoh had imagined it being entered not by thieves, but by eyes that would understand. The mingling of eras was almost palpable. A bronze tool, dulled by time, reflected the warm glow of an LED lamp. Dust motes that had drifted lazily for centuries now swirled in the wake of human movement. In the silence, they could almost hear the faint echo of the builder's last steps, the final chisel tap, the low chant of the sealing ritual. It was tempting to breathe deeply, to take in as much of that ancient air as possible. But there was also an instinct to breathe lightly, to disturb it as little as possible. Every inhalation felt like borrowing something that did not belong to this age. Perhaps that is why they lingered so long in the doorway before moving deeper, reluctant to cross too far into a space that had existed so purely in its own time. In later days, the chamber would be studied, catalogued, preserved. Its objects would be photographed, its measurements taken to the millimetre. But none of that would ever equal the moment of that first breath of air, the moment when the tomb shifted from being an idea, a rumour, a dream in stone, into something present, tangible, alive in the most unexpected way. For those who stood there, the memory would remain not as a sight or a sound, but as a sensation. The cool brush of air against the skin, carrying with it the weight of all that had lain unseen for so long, and the quiet knowledge that for the first time in over 3,000 years, the chamber had exhaled. In the weeks and months that followed, the chamber gave up many of its details but never its whole truth. Every object was examined, every marking traced, every dimension recorded, yet something remained beyond the reach of any instrument or measurement. The archaeologists spoke in careful tones of context and cultural significance, but in quiet moments they admitted to one another that they felt they were circling a centre they could not see. It was not that the tomb resisted, its walls were solid, its artefacts inert, but that its meaning seemed to dissolve when they tried to hold it too tightly. The scrolls, though beautifully preserved, offered no grand revelation. Their words were personal, fragmentary, concerned with the everyday as much as the divine. The heart's jar, for all its strange script and guarded aura, kept its seal. The map of unfamiliar lands lay mute, the coastlines and rivers etched into its surface, as enigmatic as when the Pharaoh first had it carved. Some believed this was deliberate. The Pharaoh, master of misdirection in both life and death, may have designed the tomb not to yield its final truth. Perhaps he had always intended that the innermost meaning, the thing he valued most, would be something only he could carry with him, into a realm beyond the reach of sand or stone. In that case, everything left behind, however carefully chosen, would be only a shadow of the real treasure. Others thought the opposite, that the truth was here, entirely present, but invisible to those who sought it in material form, that it lived in the arrangement of the chamber, the alignments with the stars, the silence held for centuries, the interplay of absence and presence, that the Pharaoh's final gift was not an object or a message, but an experience, one that could only be felt by standing in that space, breathing its air, knowing its story. Either way, the questions refused to be resolved. Why the crown of reeds instead of one of gold? Why the choice of personal tools over the emblems of power? Why that single cartouche in the scribe's corner, so modest yet so enduring? And perhaps most puzzling of all, why hide such a tomb so completely if in the end it was not filled with the treasures others would expect? In the evenings, after the day's work was done and the site lay quiet, some members of the team would walk out to the edge of the dunes. From there, the desert spread in every direction, a great sea of gold turned silver by the moon. The stars that had guided the Pharaoh's architects burned overhead, unchanged since his time. Looking up, it was easy to believe that the tomb was less a resting place than a conversation between earth and sky, one that had been going on for millennia and would continue long after they left. Perhaps that was the point, to build a monument to mystery itself, to create a place that would resist the full light of explanation, remaining half-veiled so that each generation would see something different in it, a riddle, a memory, a lesson, a dream. In a world where so much is claimed, measured, and consumed, here was something that could never be entirely possessed. When the excavation season ended, the entrance was sealed again, not with the same finality as in the Pharaoh's day, but with care and respect. The team left their notes, their photographs, their measurements, but the feeling they carried was something less tangible, the sense of having stood on the threshold of another mind, another world, and glimpsed only what they were meant to see. As the last of the equipment was packed away, and the desert reclaimed its quiet, the wind moved across the dunes in slow, steady waves. It brushed against the sealed stones. just as it had for centuries, and the tomb settled back into its long conversation with time. The chamber waited as it always had, not for another discovery, but simply to be what it was. And somewhere, perhaps, the Pharaoh's spirit walked under the stars, crown of reeds on his brow, knowing that his secret had been kept. That in the end, what mattered was not that the world had found his tomb, but that it could never take from him the thing he had chosen to keep. Some truths are like that. They do not survive by being revealed, but by remaining in the space between knowledge and wonder. In that space, they are eternal.